G'day folks, thanks for tuning in. Today's video is one in the series of colour theory. We'll be exploring the colour green, specifically warm greens. Green's an interesting one, because when we say green, we could be referring to a whole range of hues. All of this was mixed in from one green paint, from yellow green to lime, forest green, jade, mint, sea green, turquoise, olive and so on. Far too many for one video, so we're going to simplify it a bit. What we're usually describing is how yellow or blue a green is, followed by how saturated it is. So today we're going to be looking at a few examples of warm green, that is, greens that tend towards yellow. Green is a secondary colour, meaning we can make it by mixing two primaries, either yellow and blue or yellow and cyan, depending on which colour model you prefer to use. Because of this and the sheer diversity among greens, a lot of artists prefer not to keep tubes of green paint at all, and will instead mix their own. That being said, we'll be using a couple of dedicated greens for consistency, starting with phthalo green. It's a fairly neutral green that leans a bit towards the blue side, especially on camera. It's on the lower end of the value scale, transparent, and stains very well, which makes it a good foundational colour. If you have one green in your collection, I recommend a phthalo like this, or sap green if you wanted something warmer. My Winton's data set came with this viridian hue, which is allegedly the same pigment as my artist grade phthalo, and while it's lacking the punch, it should serve as a substitute if you have it. Other options are this permanent green light, which also came in my starter set. It's a bit more yellow and a lot brighter than phthalo, so less flexible, but it's a solid colour in its own right. At the other end is this perylene black, which is actually green. If you're familiar with the indigo I use in other videos, it's like a green version of that. Very dark, very desaturated, but highly staining, and mixes well. And, along with phthalo green and indigo, we'll be using as a foundation colour today. For our foundational colours, I'll be using phthalo green, indigo, and perylene black. To highlight, we've got titanium white, brilliant yellow pale, as well as radiant violet. At the other end we have asphaltum to use on our bases and anywhere else we may need it, as well as fanchon red. In order to keep our greens on the warm side, we'll be leaning heavily on cadmium yellow medium, which we'll be mixing into these foundational layers. As always, the general hue is more important than the specific paint, but I try to keep these colour theory videos accessible to those just starting out. Now I've gone long enough, let's get started. Like always, we'll be using our cheap size 8 round craft brushes to lay our foundation, and have a capful of thinner here to help things along. So let's jump right in, starting with the phthalo green, which we'll thin down before applying it to the model. Thin enough that it gets around and into the recesses, but not so thin that it's a wash. If some gets on the weapons or the base, no big deal, just get it on there. Now this is showing up bluer on camera, but you'll notice that it's pretty light for a foundation. It does stain very well, however, which makes it great for subsequent layering. And it's such an intense green that it'll still read well whether we subsequently go lighter or darker. Next we'll do the same thing with our other two marines, this time with the perylene black and the indigo. I'm using separate brushes for each figure, as well I'm not concerned about cross-contamination on the model itself, I want to keep my foundations separate to maximise their impact. You'll also see why it's a good idea to use bigger brushes here, as I've made a lot more work for myself by being too lazy to go find another size 8 for the indigo marine. That indigo can also be used on the weapons, and it makes a good foundation for gunmetals. If I go too thin, I can just add more paint to thicken it back up. Once that's done, we grab a new brush for our asphaltum, as we don't want that much cross-contamination, and repeat the process for the bases. The bases will take a bit more thinner, as the acrylic paste on them is more textured and absorbent than the model. But again, we don't want it so thin that it's flooding everywhere. Don't worry about getting some on the boots, as we can either incorporate those elements later, or just plain paint over them. Alright, we'll let these sit for a few minutes so that staining property can work its way in, and then come back to wipe the rest of it away. So once again we have our makeup sponges, cut to size and ready to go. We're going to start with the weapons this time, followed by the bases, as we want to minimise the amount we get into our green. By wiping them away first, most spillover should get carried off when we subsequently take away the green. Now we can really see that the phthalo green is quite powerful, despite being highly transparent. Even though we're wiping it away, it's leaving a very strong impression behind. Even though it's much lighter than the indigo and the perylene black, it's still an effective staining colour. So we do the same with our remaining marines until we're left with a nice thin foundation to work from. Now these are done, let's introduce some yellow and see what kind of warm greens we can get out of it. I have a cheap custom filbert brush here, made from a size 8 flat. By using a brush with rounded edges, we can make our blends happen a lot easier. I've got each of our foundational colours out here on the palette so you can see the effect our cadmium yellow has on them, starting with the phthalo green. Here we get a bright, vibrant green that will start applying from the top of our marine in soft, gentle strokes. It mixes on the model as we apply it, so we need to return to the palette for fresh paint if things get too muddy. But by working from top to bottom like this, we can also use that to our advantage, as things will naturally be darker the further we get from our light source. Now this is certainly bright, so if you're a Mantis Warriors fan or have striking Scorpions in your Eldar army, this could be the combination for you. I'm adding more yellow to our mix to strengthen these initial highlights on the top of the mini. This will make our highlights warmer as well as brighter, which will contrast well against our cooler shadows. Now onto the perylene black marine. Our green here is a lot less saturated, though still unmistakably warm. The same could be said for our indigo marine, though the bluish foundation makes it cooler by comparison. The difference is subtle, but it's there. Desaturated foundations, particularly warmer ones, are a good way to get more of an olive hue. Alternatively, using a less saturated yellow for our highlight, like yellow ochre, would also get us there. But by using something as rich as cadmium yellow over these two foundations gives us a strong contrast of value, hue, and saturation, which makes things a lot more visually interesting. Here they are after those initial highlights. We've got a long way to go, but now you can see how quickly we can achieve different greens with just two colours, whether we have green paint or not. Here we're going to quickly knock out the weapons and bases. While these aren't the focus of the video, it's important to get all your elements blocked in. We can quickly make a nice blue-grey by mixing brilliant yellow pale into indigo, which we can then overbrush onto the weapons, letting the sharp edges catch our brush and apply our highlights for us. We can then come in again with slightly more yellow, focusing only on the uppermost parts. You can absolutely spend more time on this if you wanted, but it doesn't take much to get a decent result. And finally, just a touch of white for the tips. For the bases, I thought mixing some yellow into brown would get us a nice warm colour that would suit the warm green we're going for on the armour. Though maybe not too warm, as a bit of brilliant yellow pale for our final highlight will help balance things out. Now sometimes I get asked why I paint my base rooms ahead of time. If we take our makeup sponge and dip it in a bit of thinner, we can wipe away the spillover. What's traditionally the last step can become one of the first. It's a bit like having your dessert before dinner. I prime by airbrush, so it takes a couple of seconds to switch over to black, but I also find that having it blocked in early helps me visualise the final product as I'm painting. Give it a go. Now that our minis have had a few minutes to set, we can add more yellow. This is basically a continuation of that first layer, but you can see the difference focusing more towards pure yellow makes. We want to take advantage of the fact that our paint mixes on the miniature, and skip what would be several layering steps with acrylics. This does mean going back for fresh yellow paint more frequently, but this just allows us more control over our highlight placement. As we come down to the legs, you can really see that difference, but we still want those upward facing elements highlighted, so it doesn't look like he's wearing different coloured pants. By now things are starting to look pretty streaky, which is common at this stage. We can fix this with a blending brush, which can be any clean, dry, round brush. We come in and tap the side of the brush against the areas we want blended, and in seconds they dissolve altogether. It's important that we tap and not brush, as pulling the paint around could result in some tearing, but that's nothing that can't be fixed either. I'm not trying to make things perfect here, as we're not done adding paint, but if you're feeling unsure about the look of your mini, blending out some of the brushwork can be a good motivator to keep going. And here we're doing the same process on the other two marines. They're really starting to look similar at this point, with the main difference being in the shadows. Conversely, our first marine is looking way brighter. So next we'll re-establish some shadows to bring things back into balance. Since our midtones are so bright, and we know our paint will mix on the mini, we can reapply some of our foundational colour to areas in shadow while still leaving room to go darker. We want to layer it on and then come in with our blending brush to work it in, resulting in a nice gradient. Now it's important to keep your blending brush dry and clean, so if you find it starting to pull, wring it out on a paper towel or just grab a clean one. And we do the same for the other marines, using the perylene black and indigo respectively. This is another relaxing step, where we can just go around on the mini, not worrying too much about brush control, and let the oils work for us. My foundational colour is going on a bit thick here, so I can apply it in fewer strokes, but it also gives us more to blend with, and we're still a ways away from our mid-tone in terms of value. Focusing on areas in shadow, paying attention to the various shapes around the model until we're left with something that looks like this. Next we take our foundational colour and heavily thin it down, resulting in a wash that we can let run into the recesses. This creates some dramatic shading for our darkest darks. You can see that even though it's the same green that we blended into the armour, in this application it shows up much darker. Now what consistency you need will vary between pigments, but you want to thin it down enough that it will flow from the brush and into the crevices when you touch the two together. We don't want to brush it on, as that thinner will wipe out our work. Now if it's not flowing, add more. If it's spilled everywhere, don't panic, let it sit and evaporate off, thicken up your mixture, and move on. It's very important to let any overflow sit, as once the thinner's evaporated, we can use our blending brush to tap away what's left. It can be hard to resist the temptation to jump in right away, but just trust the process. We do the same with our perylene black and indigo, and these two are starting to look a bit more distinct. This step is also handy for those spots we may have missed with our foundation, like the vents in the backpack. In no time at all, we bring some real definition back into the model. Now let's tackle some of the finer details and really bring these pieces together. If you've been here before, you'll know I'm a fan of making my own black by mixing brown and blue. We can also achieve something similar with green and red, as they're complementary. If we use perylene black as our green, then it'll pull the resultant grey way down in value, making for a decent black, and the red in it will pop more against that green armour. We can apply this black to the undersuit and cabling, and anywhere else you want to be black or grey. Notice that if we make a mistake, we can just blend it back in. For the eagles I'm going for a golden yellow, so we'll start from an asphaltum base. Being a reddish brown, the red in it will contrast well against the armour. I'm also putting it on the leathers for the same reason. Mixing in some yellow will get us more of a golden brown, which we can overbrush to catch the highlights on the eagles. We can also stipple this onto the leathers to create a distressed look, as the paint will blend as we go. Adding brilliant yellow pale to the mix will up the value while keeping it desaturated, with only a hint of yellow coming through. This is good for leathers, and some styles of bone. Again, by stabbing it in, we can get a whole range of scuff marks. For the eagles, I'm going back to cadmium yellow, to distinguish them from the leathers a bit, and to give more of that golden look that I'm after. And where I've messed up, I can just blend it back in, but not too much, since we're going to be highlighting those areas soon anyway. Finally, we come back in with some of that asphaltum wash to make those recesses pop. The eyes are a simple 3-step process, of asphaltum in red, followed by pure red, followed by red with a bit of yellow mixed in, highlighting progressively towards the nose. Then we come back in with a touch of white to get that reflection. At any point you can come in with your wash to tidy up any overspill, let it dry out, and then try it again. I like to use these final steps to revisit colour theory and the options that it gives us. With our bright green marine, we could introduce some white, either on its own or with some red, to desaturate our final highlights. Or we could keep pushing this vibrant, high fantasy look and use straight yellow. Using a liner brush, we can gently brush along the edges, dotting against the highest parts with our flats. It's still mixing, of course, so we can blend as we go to get a bit more of a gradient going. But for those final highlights, I'm going for a pure yellow as I can on those edges, followed by a bit of brilliant yellow pale on the highest heights. So it turns out that if you want your footage to record, you need to hit the record button. I failed to do that when finishing the other two, so sorry for that. But the process is the same, just with different colours. You can see on the palette that I've made two very distinct progressions from similar bases. For the perylene black marine, I added radiant violet to the midtones. This increases the value while desaturating, as purple and green are complements. I thought that using violet would be a nice contrast against that dark green foundation. In a similar vein, I add a brilliant yellow pale to the mix on our indigo marine. Brilliant yellow pale makes for a great natural highlight colour on its own, but it also provides a nice contrast to that indigo foundation. In this way, we can make two similar looking models end up looking quite different. But the greens on both are still distinctly warm. And here they are all together. I also threw on a quick orange-red plasma effect to the indigo marine, just to further push the contrast and create a bit more interest. And here they are a few days later, after I've applied some matte varnish. So let me know what you think, and which is your favourite down in the comments below. I'll be doing a subsequent video on cooler greens sometime in the near future, so stay tuned for that one. Thank you very much for spending time with me here today. If you had any questions about any of the products or techniques I've talked about, or have a topic you'd want me to cover in a future video, I'd love to hear it. Again, thanks very much for being here, and take care.